The Colorado Gold Rush. After gold had been discovered in 1848 Sutter's Mill, California, several parties of westward moving 49ers hauled small amounts of gold from Colorado's South Platte River, failing to report their find for several years due to their eagerness to reach the gold fields of California. A decade later, after a Georgian 49er named William Green Russell learned about the Colorado strike from his Cherokee wife, Russell set out for the region with 2 brothers and 6 others in February of 1858, unearthing the first significant gold deposits when they panned Little Dry Creek in July. When news of Russell's strike reached newspapers back east, by 1859, the Colorado Gold Rush would attract more than 100,000 fortune seekers to what was then part of the Kansas and Nebraska territory. Using the motto, Pike's Peak or Bust, 59ers, as they were known, became the first significant non-native immigrants into the Rocky Mountain region, creating the second largest mining excitement in U.S. history, at the same time founding early towns such as Denver, Boulder, Breckenridge, and Central City, along with numerous smaller towns, leading to the creation of the Colorado Territory in 1861, followed by statehood in 1876. After the initial teaser discoveries of 1858, the Colorado Gold Rush reached its peak the following year, thanks to George Jackson's discovery of a substantial placer deposit near present-day Idaho Springs, followed by John Gregory's discovery of lode gold near Black Hawk in the summer of 1859. Quickly renamed Gregory Gulch, Gregory's initial discovery, soon to be the site of the Central City Mining District, quickly became known as the richest square mile on Earth. After placer deposits were largely exhausted by 1862, attempts at hydraulic lode mining, a highly successful technique during the California Gold Rush, proved mostly unattainable due to the Rockies' mountainous terrain and harsh winter conditions. After the end of the Civil War, however, Eastern investors turned their attention to the region in the form of in situ and pit mining. By the 1870s, Colorado's gold rush days were over, infusing some 375,000 ounces of gold into the American economy. As a secondary benefit, the infusion of capital investments and the arrival of the railroad opened a new age of growth and stability to the region, making the Colorado Gold Rush a time of boom or bust during the final years of a nation's westward migration. The cultural nations of America. On a scorching hot July night in 1893 Chicago, in a city overrun with tourists attending the World's Fair, a 31-year-old associate professor named Frederick Jackson Turner delivered an essay to the American Historical Association that would forever change the study and complexity of U.S. history. What is now known as his frontier thesis, Turner explained how westward expansion and manifest destiny had stripped European settlers of their ancestral feudalistic backgrounds, forging an American nation not by cultural differences, but by shared challenges and opportunities inherent in an ever-expanding geographic footprint. Years later, however, after the frontier had been fully tamed, Turner would reject his own frontier theory after spending years studying the many cultural pockets that make up, in his words, the United States of Europe. Turner's work would be further illuminated by Colin Woodard's 2021 publication of American Nations, where he argues that the United States is far from a homogeneous entity, but rather a collection of distinct nations replete with individual values, histories, and political orientations. Of his 11 identified nations, Yankeedom embodies the residue of Puritan New England, while New Netherland reflects the Dutch culture within the greater New York region. The Midlands of the Midwest value pluralism and compromise, while the Tidewater region values social hierarchy and respect of authority. Greater Appalachia, as settled by war-ravaged borderlands people from Northern Ireland, retains a hearty suspicion of centralized authority, while the Deep South values states' rights, rigid social structure, and a distinct African-American culture. Next comes El Norte, which spans the southwestern U.S. and northern Mexico, while the left coast covers northern California up to the Canadian border, with values of environmentalism, social justice, and participatory democracy, while the far west, settled by explorers, cowboys, and miners, values individualism and a rugged frontier spirit. New France epicenters around Louisiana and French Canada, embracing Catholicism and a sense of noblesse oblige, which is an inferred responsibility of the privileged over those less fortunate. Last but not least is the First Nation, which encompasses Native American heritage throughout the continent, replete with ancestral traditions, tribal sovereignty, a complex relationship with the federal government, and a deep spiritual connection to the land, making the nations of America an intricate web of ancestral cultural influences. The Donner Party. The weather sweet spot for pioneers bound for California was mid to late April, but as ill fate would have it, the Donner Party, led by wealthy brothers Jacob and George Donner, failed to leave Independence, Missouri until May the 12th, giving them the dubious distinction of being the last major pioneer train of the 1846 season. "I am beginning to feel alarmed at the tardiness of our movements," one of the immigrants wrote, "and fearful that winter will find us in the snowy mountains of California." Most California-bound pioneers headed north through Idaho after reaching Wyoming, before turning south across Nevada, but the Donner brothers had fallen for a route proposed by a dishonest guidebook author named Lansford Hastings, who bragged of a shorter route across the Wasatch Mountains and the Salt Lake Desert. Despite the fact that no one had yet traveled the Hastings cutoff with wagons, the 20 wagons of the Donner Party set out for the cutoff, even after mountain man James Kleiman warned against such a divergence. For the brothers' arrogance or ignorance, the decision would add nearly a month to the wagon train's journey west. By early November 1846, the Donner Party reached the perilous slopes of the Sierra Nevada mountains, a scant 100 miles from their intended destination, until an early blizzard stalled them in their tracks, forcing a retreat to Truckee Lake to ride out the winter in a ramshackle assembly of tents and hastily constructed cabins. A month into their encampment, on December 16, 1846, 15 able-bodied men strapped on homemade snowshoes and set out for help, only to wander aimlessly over the frozen landscape until they collapsed from starvation. After several in the party died of natural causes, the remaining men took to cannibalism, which allowed 7 to make it to a ranch in California where they organized rescue efforts that wouldn't commence until February of 1847. The last to be rescued was Prussian pioneer Louis Kesselberg, who was located in April, half mad and surrounded by the cannibalized remains of his former associates. Of the 81 pioneers who were forced to winter at Truckee Lake, 45 eventually walked out alive. The Donner brothers would lose their wives and 4 children for their poor decision-making, and of the dozen families that made up the wagon train, only 2, the Reeds and the Breens, managed to arrive into California without suffering a single fatality. The Great California Flood of 1862. A pounding rain took up on Christmas Eve of 1861, continuing unabated for the next 43 days of terror, panic, and death, transforming rivers running down from the Sierra Nevada mountains into raging spillways that swept away entire communities and mining settlements. Overflowing rivers poured water into the state's low-lying San Joaquin Valley, turning it into an inland sea 300 miles long, 20 miles wide, and 30 feet deep, drowning hundreds of thousands of cattle, while the human death toll, although never accurately accounted for, most likely rose into the thousands. Downtown Sacramento submerged under 10 feet of brackish water, forcing the state legislature to move to San Francisco until the city dried out. Destroying 25% of all California real estate, by the time the storm was over, the state of California was bankrupt. While the Central Valley took the brunt of the storm, much of the remaining west coast of America suffered egregious flooding and loss of property and life, only to worsen in the spring when melting mountain snowpack brought on a second round of torrential flooding. Marysville, Santa Rosa, Auburn, parts of Sonora, Nevada City, and Napa were all underwater, while smaller towns like Empire City and Mokelumne City were simply erased from the face of the earth. Even in Los Angeles, the LA, San Gabriel, and Santa Ana rivers all flooded and merged, creating an inland sea 18 miles wide. Further inland in Riverside, the Santa Ana River completely washed away the small town of Aguamanza near present-day Colton. In the Mojave Desert, Owens Valley was also devastated by floods, causing great misery among the Paiute people, since the game animals they relied upon for food had drowned and washed away. The storm also paused the Civil War effort in the Pacific Coast Theater, which had been heating up in the months leading up to the protracted storm. Now that the Central Valley is home to 6 million Californians, on land producing crops worth $20 billion annually, meteorologists and climatologists have studied sediment deposits in widespread locations, which indicate the region has received similar storms every 2 centuries, going back at least over the past 2,000 years. Caused by atmospheric rivers that build over the Pacific Ocean, generally 1,000 miles in length and 250 miles wide, in a predictive model known as ArcStorm, which was updated and revised in 2022. Scientists believe a repeat of the storm of 1862 is well overdue. Modeling a relentless yet shorter storm lasting 23 days, such an event would cause $400 billion in property and agricultural losses, not to mention mass evacuations from low-lying areas, making the Great California Flood of 1862 a long-forgotten nightmare during the early history of the Golden State. The Homestead Act of 1862. During a February 1861 speech in Ohio, President Abraham Lincoln said that a Homestead Act was worthy of consideration and that the wild lands of the country should be distributed so that every man should have the means and opportunity of benefiting his condition. At Lincoln's behest, Congress signed the Homestead Act into law on May 20, 1862, which would stand for the next 124 years, resulting in 10% of the nation's land claimed and settled by American pioneers and speculators. Open to all U.S. citizens and prospective citizens, the Homestead Act allowed settlers to obtain no more than 160 acres of land, which eventually saw 1.6 million deeds awarded, in the process forcing Native Americans onto designated reservations to make room for the flood of western-bound settlers. Homesteaders paid $12 up front, $10 for a temporary claim on their chosen land, plus a $2 commission to a land agent, followed by a $6 payment for a clear title, after certain conditions had been met. Before a clear land title could be obtained, homesteaders required 2 neighbors or friends to attest that the homesteader in question was 21 years of age, had lived continuously on the land for 5 years, while building a home or other structures to improve the land. Union soldiers, on the other hand, could circumvent and shorten the 5-year residency requirement by serving in the Civil War. Land titles could also be purchased outright for $1.25 per acre after 6 months of verified residency. In the end, due to ambiguous clauses in the Homestead Act and its congressional revisions, most of the land went to land speculators, cattlemen, miners, lumbermen, and railroads, a practice which was allowed to flourish due to a shortage of investigators. Of the 500 million acres dispersed by the General Land Office between 1862 and 1904, only 80 million acres went to homesteaders. For the most part, homesteading ended with the signing of the Taylor Grazing Act of 1934, while the Homestead Act was finally repealed in 1976 with the signing of the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, which mandated that public lands be retained by the federal government. Homesteading was allowed to continue in Alaska for a decade more, making the Homestead Act an important instrument in westward American expansion. The Indian Removal Act. Amid increasing pressures by European settlers in the southeast United States to remove Native Americans from lands east of the Mississippi, President Andrew Jackson gained congressional passage of the Indian Removal Act in 1830, which kicked off a series of forced relocations of Native Americans that collectively became known as the Trail of Tears. First came the removal of the Choctaw people in 1831, followed by the Seminoles in 1832, the Creeks in 1834, the Chickasaws in 1837, and the Cherokee Nation in 1838. Of the 16,543 Cherokees that were relocated in 38, scholars now believe that approximately 2,000 to 8,000 perished along their route into modern-day Oklahoma. Known collectively as the 5 civilized tribes, all told, some 60,000 Native Americans and black slaves that lived among the tribes were forced to relocate out of the American Southeast, causing many to die from exposure, disease, and starvation along the 2,200 miles of land and sea routes established by the federal government. While the U.S. government at first acknowledged that 400 Native Americans had perished during these forced marches, scholars soon revised that number upwards to 4,000, although many historians today suggest that the Cherokee migration alone killed 1/4 to 1/3 of her people when they were forced to march 10 miles a day in knee-deep snow. By 1837, some 46,000 Native Americans had been removed from their homelands, opening up 25 million acres for resettlement by predominantly European immigrants. People at the time of the Trail of Tears migrations knew what the federal government was doing was wrong, maybe even illegal in light of previously signed treaties with the southeastern Indians, yet under the uniquely American belief in manifest destiny and American exceptionalism, most white Americans looked away in the name of progress, expansion, and a greed-inspired thirst for land ownership. The Kansas-Nebraska Act. After gold was discovered in California, the territory's petition to become a slave-free state upset the teetering balance between free and slaveholding states, leading Senators Henry Clay and Stephen Douglas to push through the Compromise of 1850, which allowed California to enter the Union as a free state, while the future states of Utah, New Mexico, Nevada, and Arizona were left to decide the issue of slavery by individual statewide voting, known as popular sovereignty. To further sweeten the deal for slave-owning Southern legislators, the Fugitive Slave Act mandated free states to capture and remand runaway slaves to their Southern owners, a crucial part of the Compromise of 1850, which in turn galvanized abolitionists in their quest to outlaw slavery in the United States and her territories. Known as the Little Giant, Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas lobbied his peers for a northern route for the first transcontinental railroad, bisecting the future states of Kansas and Nebraska, which were acquired from France after the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. Despite heavy opposition by abolitionists and free soilers, the later opposing the extension of slavery into any new territory, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, creating the territories of Kansas and Nebraska under the Edicts of Popular Sovereignty, at the same time repealing the Missouri Compromise of 1821, which outlawed slavery in territories north of the 36th parallel. The bill was signed into law by President Franklin Pierce on May 30, 1854, which quickly inspired pro- and anti-slavery activists to invade Kansas for a series of violent clashes, now known as Bleeding Kansas. As the sectional divides over slavery intensified in the wake of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the bill proved to be the death knell of the once dominant Whig Party, which collapsed just as abruptly as its meteoric rise to power in 1834. Leading Whig legislators such as Thaddeus Stevens, William Seward, and Abraham Lincoln switched to the newly formed Republican Party, while conservative anti-immigrant nativist proponents followed Millard Fillmore into the Know-Nothing Party, making the Kansas-Nebraska Act one of the final ignition points before a nation's devolution into civil war.